I've been mic'd up, so I hope you can all hear me at the back. And thank you. Brian was offering thanks, but I feel I should start by offering them back again to Brian and Anna and Giles and all the team for enabling this seminar to go ahead. We missed it greatly during COVID, and it's wonderful to be back here in this splendid new venue. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, as Brian said in the introduction, I wrote that throughout the history of the People's Republic of China, museums didn't present much of a cultural threat. And that's because China was able to frame their present history and their past history in a manner that they wished to. And to a certain extent, that continues to be done. And I'm going to start with a key example, if you like, and that is the National Museum in Beijing. It started life being called the Museum of the Chinese Revolution. Then it became the National Museum of History, which is what you see here, and it's recently been reframed as the National Museum of China. Now, the establishment of the first institution, the Museum of the Chinese Revolution, opened its doors in Beijing's Tiananmen Square on the 1st of July 1961, which happened to be the 40th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, it was a complicated political and cultural decision on the part of the Chinese government. Originally, the museum was never intended to be an artistic enterprise. Rather, it was conceived as a political institution to serve the interests of the party. Staff members collected artifacts relating to the Chinese Communist Revolution, commissioned historical paintings, and arranged displays according to the historical framework which had been laid down by Mao Zedong. And these pictures show you the museum as it morphed into being the Museum of Chinese History during the late 1960s and early 1970s. I happened to be a student in China from 1975 to 1976, so this is an incarnation that I remember well. I studied in Beijing at the Languages Institute there, and I used to ride my bicycle into the center and go to the few institutions that were open, which included museums. They were good places to go. So here is a picture of Tiananmen Square on the left, as I remember it. If any of you have been to Beijing now, you know that Tiananmen Square is now fenced off with a memorial in the middle and loads of traffic. In those days, it was just a big empty space, and you could ride your bicycle right into the square and park outside the museum, which was very nice. And this is the handbook, the 1976 handbook to the Historical Museum. Now, I say you could visit museums. It was a bit of an arduous process. First of all, one had to get in, one had to pay the fee, which as a poor student was quite difficult. And then you had to wade through several acres of political propaganda before you got to the meat, which were the historical exhibitions. But it was still worth doing. I did it quite often in those days. Now, the museum had itself reincarnated in the late 1990s, and it reopened in 2011 as the National Museum of China after extensive renovations. So you can see it's still basically this Stalinist building of the 1950s, but it's got a green roof, and inside it's very wonderful and modernized, and it has been extended quite a lot. And I just want to show you some of the exhibits. These are the exhibits as I remember them in the 1970s. You can see the revolutionary content and the shiny linoleum on the floor, and those lights, which are very much of the period, that not just in Chinese museums, but I think in museums elsewhere as well. And here's one of the modern galleries. This happens to be the Chinese Sculpture Gallery. And one thing that the National Museum does now is to commandeer all the best new archaeological finds from all over China, because this is, after all, the National Museum. So when there's a significant archaeological excavation or some discovery somewhere, it's quite likely that the National Museum in Beijing will ask the pieces to be sent there. So you have to be rather careful. I've been caught out before if you're going somewhere hoping to see something wonderful and you see a little notice that says on display in the National Museum and you think, oh, bother. But after all, they are the National Museum. And the National Museum has a very ritzy website in several languages, including English, multilingual. And you can find on the website new exhibitions, major thematic exhibitions, permanent exhibitions, travelling exhibitions, past exhibitions, and virtual exhibitions. And it has a mission statement, which you can see up here, put out by its director. The National Museum of China is the highest institution in China that collects, studies, displays, and interprets the material evidence which best manifests the fineness of China's traditional culture, revolutionary culture, and advanced socialist culture. Being China's culture lounge, it cherishes national memories, passes down national cultural identity, and promotes exchanges between civilizations. It is also devoted to developing a discourse specific to Chinese cultural heritage that is in line with the mainstream values and ideology of the country and raising public cultural awareness and confidence. Now, think what you may of such a statement, but it's a very confident statement, and it embodies, really, I think, where contemporary China is going, that confidence in its past and its interactions with the outside world. Now, I'm talking in the first bit of my lecture about public institutions, so I'll move on to another one which may be known to some of you, and that is the Shanghai Museum. And this is another national museum in China's second biggest city, but it's rather a different animal, I would say. So the museum was founded after the revolution in 1952, and it was first opened to the public in the former Shanghai Racecourse clubhouse. So a colonial clubhouse is where they put the original museum. The founding collections came principally from three sources: a batch of artifacts gathered by the Communist Third Field Army during the Civil War from accidental finds and confiscations of private property, and brought to Shanghai upon the communist conquest of the city, which was early in 1950. Pieces confiscated by the customs service, items sold by private collectors due to political pressure during political purges, and then purchased by the government. And there was also a former Shanghai municipal museum, which was quite active in the 1930s, and that was merged with the Shanghai Museum in 1952. In the years after 52, the museum's collections were further enriched from other private and institutional collections in Shanghai, including the collection of the former Shanghai Museum of the Royal Asiatic Society, and that is a very interesting institution that has old papers going back to the early 20th century. And they were moved to the museum as foreign institutions gradually left the city during the course of the 1950s. In the late 1950s, there was rather a terrible campaign called the Great Leap Forward, in which Mao Zedong attempted to drag China up to the level of other countries in the world through agricultural and industrial revolution and mechanization. I'm sure that many of you know about that, and I won't talk about it here, but during that campaign, Shanghai, because it was a traditional centre of academic activity, suffered rather badly, but the museum was very courageous, and they rescued lots of ancient bronzes which had been confiscated, which were either going to be donated to the museum, but the intention was, by the more extreme political elements, that they would melt down these ancient bronzes. So the museum rescued those in the 1950s. In 1959, the museum moved into the Zhonghui building at 16 South Henan Road, which housed insurance companies and bank offices. That's what you're seeing here. And when I first knew the Shanghai Museum, that's where it was, in 1.5 floors of this bank building. The museum's work largely halted as a result of the Cultural Revolution, which, as Brian has told us, was 1966 to 76, so there was a pause. After the end of the revolution, as one of China's most important museums, the collections have continued to be enriched with the fruit of donations, government purchases, and important finds from archaeological excavations. The growth of its collections put enormous pressure on the cramped premises here in the bank building. For his role in ensuring a large, purpose-built home, it's said that Shanghai Museum owes much of its current existence to Ma Chengyuan, who was its director from 1985 until his retirement in 1999. When a new museum was omitted from Shanghai's 5-year reconstruction plan in 1992, Ma lobbied the mayor for its rebuilding. He took the mayor Huang, along to this dilapidated building, the Zhonghui Bank building, and the mayor capitulated, and he agreed to allocate a prime site for a new museum in People's Square, which is right in the middle of downtown Shanghai. But the museum had to raise its own building funds, which in the early 1990s, China was not such a prosperous country as it is now, and that was a considerable ask. So museum director Ma Chengyuan raised $25 million by leasing the old bank buildings to a Hong Kong developer, clever man. He also made many trips abroad to solicit donations, mainly from the Shanghai diaspora who'd fled to Hong Kong after the Communist Revolution, and he raised about another $10 million that way. The money still ran short, but he lobbied and lobbied and lobbied and eventually won another 140 million yuan from the city government to complete the building. At that time, the yuan, the Chinese currency, was about 10 to the pound. So it's about 14 million pounds, which from a municipal government in that era was quite good going. Ma Chengyuan was a very extraordinary man. I knew him when he came to Britain in the 1980s, early 1990s. He was looked after by members of the Chinese diaspora resident here in UK. And he came to the V&A, which is where I was then working. And in addition to being a very dynamic little man, he was quite short. He was even shorter than me. And he wore a bootleg tie, very chic. But he was also an expert. He was an expert in Chinese ancient bronzes. I showed him the bronze collection at the V&A, and he told me amazing things about it. So he was an exceptional human being, in my opinion, as a director. Construction of the current building started in August 1993. It was inaugurated on October the 12th, 1996 to wide acclaim, and I attended the opening. It was really a good thing. Then there's a wonderful picture of us all on the front steps. It was designed by a local architect, you can see here on the screen, and it was designed to mimic the shape of an ancient bronze cooking vessel called a ding. See, it's a round vessel, and those loops on the front, those are the handles of the bronze vessel. Inside are 3 floors of galleries with central escalators and stairs, and the most wonderful bookshop. If you ever go to Shanghai and you're ever interested in art, go to the bookshop. It also, of course, has a website. It's a little less slick than that of the National Museum, but it's nonetheless clear and informative and in several languages, primarily English. The Shanghai Museum was the first museum to invite exhibitions from abroad that depict other cultures and places. For example, oh, I'm sorry, I should have showed you these. These are 2 of the galleries in the Shanghai Museum, the Bronzes Gallery on the left and part of the Ceramics Gallery on the right. It really is worth going to see that museum. I would really recommend it. It's almost too popular now. When I first went in the 1990s, it was relatively empty, but now there's a real throng in there because people do appreciate it. So getting back to its international exhibitions, in 2015 it hosted the Armory Treasury of the Russian Sovereigns from the Moscow Kremlin Museum. In 2017, the History of the World in 100 Objects from the British Museum. In 2018, Pathways to Modernism, American Art 1865 to 1945 from the Art Institute of Chicago. In 2021, West Encounters East, a cultural conversation between Chinese and European ceramics from the Guimet Museum. And the current exhibition is from the National Gallery in London, Botticelli to Van Gogh, Masterpieces from the National Gallery, London. So it's really a place. Shanghai has always, as you know, been a very cosmopolitan city that's quite open to the outside world, but it really spearheaded this movement in China, which is now widespread, to welcome cultural displays from countries around the world. And I must tell you a little story about going to one of these. In the early 2000s, they had an exhibition from the Prado of Spanish painting. And I'd never been to Madrid. And I thought, well, this would be a very good opportunity to actually see some Spanish paintings. So I went along to the exhibition, which was wonderful. And I saw wonderful wonderful Spanish paintings. But I did notice with a Chinese audience there that they were all religious paintings, and they were amazingly bloody. There were crucifixions. There were various saints getting horrible things done to them, pierced with arrows and burned and boiled in oil, and there was a lot of blood and gore. So I walked around looking at these fantastic paintings, and they all had very, very long labels in Chinese, trying to explain the context of these extraordinary paintings. And there was also an earphone, people were walking around with a commentary. And I noticed lots of earnest, rather puzzled faces looking at these extraordinary paintings. It was quite interesting, I must say. At the Shanghai Museum recently opened, in 2021 in fact, opened a new 80,000 square metre branch in the city's Pudong district across the river, which is mainly dedicated to contemporary art. So it's a flourishing institution. Now, staying with the theme of public museums, as it were, or official museums, I should mention provincial museums because, as you know, China is a vast country, and each of these provinces on the map is the size of a European country with many millions of inhabitants. So the provincial museums of each province are very important places and full of wonderful things. You know, you can go around. And I've just put arrows from 3 of the provinces. In the west there's Gansu. That's a western province, traditionally quite poor. It's sort of on the gateway to the Silk Route out. It's one of those regions that Xi Jinping is trying to pump money into, the western regions. Then the second one I'm going to show you a picture of is Shanxi, I think, Henan province. In the center there, that's a province on the Yellow River, and that's really the cradle of Chinese civilization. That's where many of the ancient remains are found. It's a very rich area. And then down in the south, Guangdong, and Guangdong, of course, is where Guangzhou is canton. So it's a rich province. It's long been connected to the West, for hundreds of years. So they're 3 very different provinces. And if you look at their museums, that rather shows. This is the Guangdong Provincial Museum, which was designed by Ove Arup in 2010. A whiz-bang, modern, fantastic space. The picture on the left, at night, it lights up sort of red and the colours change. It's rather amazing. And there's the Henan Provincial Museum, which opened in 1997. That's also a local Chinese architect. It's also supposed to be in the shape of an ancient Chinese artifact. It's rather, in my view, a kind of showy building, but it has wonderful things inside it. And then the poor old Gansu Provincial Museum, which opened in 1956, you see the same old Stalinist building of that early phase of museum building in China. But the Gansu Museum is quite good inside, and a lot of these museums have had modernization and air conditioning and what have you. And all of them have websites, even the Gansu Museum. And it has rather a rudimentary website. If you click on a link, it's in English. But when you click on images, it immediately reverts to Chinese. So it's not quite stable, but it's there. You know, they're communicating. Now, I want to talk, these are all, these are all official museums, public museums, museums endorsed by the country, the state, and the provinces. Now I want to talk a little bit about private museums. Talking about private museums, I should tell you that a new museum opened in China every 2 days on average over the 5 years up to 2020, with the total number of museums nationwide rising from 4,692 in 2016 to 5,788 in 2020, and that's according to official data. There's lots of other things that don't register, I think, but that's official data. The data showed that the annual number of visits has increased from 700 million to 1.2 billion. During the same period, China has achieved the development goal of building one museum for every 250,000 people, while several regions, such as Beijing, because it's the capital, Shanxi, and Gansu, because they're rather remote, have one museum per 110,000 to 130,000 people on average. Now, the Chinese are fantastically keen on statistics, but the statistics drive a real goal, which is to open up museums and bring culture to the widest base of people. In state controlled museums, the content will be to some extent controlled. I don't mean they won't show things, but what I mean is that the labelling and information will be controlled. But in private museums, it's pretty uncontrolled sometimes, particularly if you go to museums in sort of second cities. Few Chinese museums are like contemporary Western models for public institutions, which are typically run either by a cultural ministry, as in Europe, or a board of trustees operating in the legal realm of the non-profit, as in the USA. For example, there are few, if any, museums in China that do not rent out their exhibition spaces, thus allowing anyone with sufficient means to exhibit whatever they like, so long as it's not too politically sensitive. This approach is quite different from that of Western museums, which hold strict distinctions between private and public ownership, separate historical from contemporary periods, art from history, originals from museum reproductions, and of course are largely, although not entirely, but largely sequestered from political influence. At the same time, most Chinese museums charge little, if any, admission, and thus are public in a sense that European museums are, but few American museums are. There are other things that museums do, I should say, which are not quite so cultural. I went to a wonderful new museum of bamboo carving that had opened in a city on the east coast of China. It's in a region which is very hot and wet. That's where bamboo grows. And the museum was fantastic. But the director told me that in the summer months they had terrific problems because the museum would fill up with people because it was air conditioned. So everybody would rush in there to cool down, which was not quite the intention. Ironically, in the often paradoxical intermingling of public and private that marks China's unique mode of state-sponsored capitalism, the new institutions that have attracted the most public attention are actually designated private museums because they are run by non-governmental individuals. Officially, these museums function in the conceptual administrative space of the Minjian. They're enterprises for the people and by the people. as opposed to that of the Guanfang, which means officialdom. So many museums have been built in the past 15 years that it's rather difficult to classify them. Many of the best funded and best run are contemporary art museums, such as the Ullens Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, and that's in the 798 district, which is in the northeast of the city. It's one of those trendy spaces. It used to be a dormitory town for workers, and it's filled with little buildings, but now it's been, and there are lots of small-scale industrial work used to go on there. Now it's been transformed into this tremendously trendy space, and the Ullens Museum for the Ullens Center for Contemporary Art is very well known. It's a leading independent institution, founded in 2007, and it welcomes more than 1 million visitors a year. And it shows this kind of thing. You know the style. It was founded by the Ullens family, the Belgian aristocratic family, and you may have read rather sadly in April of this year that Mimi Ullens was killed by her husband Guy's son. There was a great scandal. I don't know whether you read about that, but these were the people who put money behind this contemporary centre, and it is well run, and it does have good displays in it, but it's for people who like the contemporary. The museums like the Ullens Centre have drawn on a talented pool of cosmopolitan art professionals who've deftly navigated the international art world and brought much attention to contemporary Chinese and foreign artists. But these are only a few of the 1,500 such museums that exist. Many more new private museums house the idiosyncratic art collections of the newly wealthy and well-connected collector class, whose members are often at once owner, builder, and director. These museums include the China Red Sandalwood Museum and the African Tribe Museum, which are both in Beijing, and they showcase their owners' obsessions with, respectively, huge red sandalwood sculpture and furniture and African wood carvings. There are other museums, such as the Beijing Museum of Tap Water, which is a corporate museum for the water industry. I must admit I've never been to it, but it might be worth a visit. Yes. Some emerging museums are legitimised through partnerships with prominent Western universities and museums, and one such is the Design Museum, which was developed by the China Merchants Group in collaboration with London's Victoria and Albert Museum, and which opened in 2017 in Sherco. Sherco is the coastal bit of the southern coastal city of Shenzhen, just up from Canton. There's a whole museum quarter there. There's a natural history museum, there's lots of museums, and the V&A stepped in and inaugurated this rather wonderful design museum, which is rather carefully controlled. And the initial Values of Design exhibition that opened in December 2017 presented more than 250 objects drawn from the V&A's extensive permanent collection. It offers local audiences a unique opportunity to explore the historical and geographical diversity of objects from around the world, while exploring critical issues about design. This exhibition that I'm showing you here touched on and highlighted some of the most important design museums from the past and gave a global perspective on the subject through 7 themed sections: performance, cost, problem solving, materials, identity, communication, and wonder. And a colleague of mine, I've long left the V&A, but a colleague of mine actually went over to oversee the developing of this museum and was present throughout the building process, and then when the first exhibition was put on. So that's quite an interesting example of a private museum, I think you could call it, but collaborating with a Western public institution. There's rather a different kettle of fish. In nearby Shenzhen, which is the town that I mentioned to you, Shenzhen and Shekou are quite close to one another. And that's the Overseas Chinese Town Enterprises, the OCT Design Museum. In this city, in Shenzhen, which is a really go-ahead, vibrant, commercial city, it was that city which was set up in the late 1980s when China opened up to the outside world and immediately exploded in population and in manufacturing. And I think it's that city also which sends a plume of smoke and other noxious things down southwards over Hong Kong when you go there at the wrong time of year. But Shenzhen is very, very vibrant, filled with very aspirational people. And a wealthy collector there helped to build the most vibrant arts district in the centre of the city by giving favourable treatment and lower rents to venues dedicated to art, design, crafts and music, including a state-run contemporary art museum. So this Overseas Chinese Town Enterprises Museum is state-run, but the money was provided privately. And it focuses mainly on Chinese fashion shows, product design, and conceptual automotive shows. So they like cars, they like clothes. This is a kind of museum of the nouveau riche, if you like. And this is obviously an artist's impression of the museum, but it is an architect's impression, but it is rather impressive, I must say. On the outskirts of this amazing city, another private developer's cultural highland is an arts retreat in the mountains that features museums devoted to less broadly appealing fare, such as his own paintings and children's homework drawings. So if you've got enough money, you can open a museum and you can put what you like in it. There are many, many other private museums that operate unregistered without official acknowledgement and are not included in the government's severely, I think, underestimated count of private museums. They only count 1,500 museums, but certainly within whatever number it is, there's certainly more than one that challenges the limits of what we had once thought a museum might be. Now I want to talk about two outstanding private museums, I think. The first is the Long Museum, and it's called the Long. People call it the Long Museum, but Long is the word for Chinese dragon. And it was founded by husband and wife art collectors, Mr. Liu Yitian and Miss Wang Wei, two formidable people, billionaires. He made his fortune in stock trading, real estate and pharmaceuticals starting in the 1990s. And their Long Museum now has 3 sites in the cities of Shanghai and Chongqing. So Shanghai you would expect. Chongqing, more surprising, Chongqing is that city on the Yangtze, far inland in China in Sichuan province. It has a family connection to one of the collectors. And of course, it's a hugely populous city. So it's, in Chinese terms, not surprising. So they have 3 museums. There's the Long Museum in Pudong, which is the new area of Shanghai that's been developed. The Long Museum in the West Bund, that's in the older area of Shanghai, and the Long Museum in Chongqing. And these 3 opened between 2013 and 2020. And they're private art museums, but they're open to the public. They house a large collection of artworks, including traditional and contemporary Chinese art, Chinese revolutionary art, as well as other contemporary artworks that originate from various parts of the world, including Asia, Europe, and the United States. And in those museums, there are some really wonderful pieces. These 2 are quite formidable, but they have particular tastes, very, very deep pockets. And you can see some very good things in their private museums. To give you an example, it was Mr. Liu who bought this chicken cup in April 2014 in Hong Kong for 281 million Hong Kong dollars. There was a huge thing about it in the papers. There was a huge hullabaloo and gazar. It was said to be the most expensive thing ever bought. I wasn't there at the auction. Such things rather bore me, I have to say. But I gather that when he was successful in buying it, there was a huge round of applause, because buying heroically at auction, being the top bidder, is seen as being a very admirable thing to do. Now, the second museum I want to talk to you about is the Shanghai Guanfu Museum, which operates in one floor of a central city office block in Shanghai and has 4 permanent exhibition halls. And they are the Hall of Porcelain, the Hall of East and West, that explains the westward spread of Eastern culture, the Hall of Goldware, the Hall of Sculpture, and a contemporary exhibition hall. Actually, there was a previous Guanfu Museum which was opened in Beijing by a man called Ma Weidu on the 30th of October 1996. And it was, in fact, among the first of the private museums in the People's Republic of China. The museum was originally located on Liulichang Street. Liulichang was the street of antique sellers that was just south of the Forbidden City. So it was historically a place where artifacts, antiquities, paintings would be gathered together. So he opened his first museum there, and he had mainly exhibits of ceramic, domestic furniture, jade, lacquer, metalwork, cloisonné enamel, architectural carvings, and contemporary oil paintings. The museum in Beijing then moved to Beijing's financial district in 2004, where the museum is currently located. And you find that a lot of art institutions in China and in Hong Kong are located in the big active financial centres. Art and money go hand in hand. Now, Ma Weidu is an interesting man. He's famous in China as an antique collector, and he in fact hosts several TV programs where he shares his experience of antique collecting with a huge audience. He's one of the best known faces in China. If you go on television in China, you'll be known to billions. And he has got up to various stunts on television. But I think he's quite serious about his antique collecting and about making it public. And he's also a wild aid ambassador for the poor endangered rhino, which is quite an interesting thing for a premier Chinese collector to do, wouldn't you think? As the market for rhino horn is chiefly, of course, in China. So if you have a man called Ma Weidu, who has a very high public profile, speaking on behalf of the rhino, that's quite a powerful ambassador. Now, I'm going to finish my talk by showing you a picture of this place, which you may have noticed I haven't mentioned. This is, of course, the Forbidden City in the centre of Beijing. I'm not going to talk a great deal about this museum because to do so, I think, would almost take an entire lecture. You know, it's a very special place in itself. You could call it both a public and a private museum. It's certainly a public museum now. It is the Forbidden City Museum. It's open to millions of tourists all over the world. It exhibits the belongings of the former imperial family, but it also collects. It collects pieces from excavation, it collects from private collectors, it buys overseas, as do several Chinese museums. I haven't mentioned that before in my lecture, but often in auctions, and I'm sure John Axford would know all about this, but many of the buyers of Chinese art are Chinese. Many of them, of course, are private collectors or people with money, but Chinese museums do also get a showing at those auctions. So back to the Forbidden City. Well, it sits at an odd juxtaposition. At the beginning of this lecture, I started talking about the National Museum, which was previously known as a Museum of History. The National Museum sits on Tiananmen Square, so right in the centre of the political heart of China. The Forbidden City stands at the north end of Tiananmen Square, and it represents the past of China, the imperial past of China. So I think when you're considering the enormous explosion of activity in Chinese museums over the previous 30 years, I would say, 35 years maybe, these two museums, the Forbidden City Museum and the National Museum, they're sort of bookends on that type of activity. And in between those bookends, in every provincial city in China, in every small town, there are cultural institutions arising, emerging, all being replenished and renewed. So I don't know what we're going to hear over the next 2 days about the state of public and private museums in the UK and in the West. But in China, my impression of them, through going there over more than 40 years, is that the museum sector is booming and continuing to expand, but it's a slightly uncontrolled wild beast, and who knows where it will end up. Thank you.